Hello and welcome to introducing AWS Outpost Servers. I am Adam Carter. I'm a principal product manager at AWS, specifically on Outpost Servers. And I'm joined today by Josh Cohen, a solution architect, who's going to help me out with pieces of this presentation. You may be a bit surprised to see this agenda maybe coming from an AWS context, but realistically, there is a lot that we're going to cover here about where we're at with our hybrid and edge capabilities and update you specifically around Outpost servers and their new introduction, a bit about what differentiates them and how these are not just, they're not just boxes with CPUs in them, and a little bit about how you design with that system and how we utilize these systems and how you might want to get started. So we want to talk first about why this is important. Realistically, while you may be all in on cloud, it's and that may be the vision and how apps are developed for you, there's realistic issues with latency and with where you can process data and keep data and where it might have gravity that you have to deal with, that some customers need to have some applications that can remain on premises. These fall into these two major buckets, essentially. If we're looking at latency sensitive stuff, this has to do everything with where your app needs to run and what it needs to interact with. This might be a factory where you're interacting with lots of on-premises equipment, and you need response times to directly to be low to directly affect how efficient your floor is. And in cases like that, the region capabilities might not be at a low enough response time for you. So there are absolutely just pure speed reasons why customers need to be able to work on something that's got a really low latency and is a local compute. And when we're talking about the data side of things, there's various scenarios for local data. Maybe that's, healthcare needing large images, but very fast access to something. Maybe that's a lot of ingest of data that is just too expensive to send offsite and needs to be processed locally. And then, of course, somebody can always force your hand, maybe by bringing some regulation or legal reason why you must keep data in a certain location. So when we're faced with having to be on premises and we can't do things in the cloud, you've got a lot of challenges that are faced. There's kind of this status quo where you'd normally procure maybe some hardware or a system, you'd implement some virtualization around that. You'd need some team or individual to manage that system depending on how difficult it is, update it, monitor it, etc. And there may be big differences in what your developers see as far as their development environment or even how they need to architect their application if they're looking at utilizing, just a typical on-premises infrastructure. The real problem behind these things, while we're probably familiar with these frustrations, is more what it does to the business of really slowing down the business from being able to implement new ideas, new initiatives really quickly, and to not be slowed down by these procurement processes and by having to worry about essentially this undifferentiated heavy lifting that's being done here. You also can avoid, a lot of grumpiness in development, maybe around having to architect in two different ways to do on-prem and in cloud. So I want to talk a bit about how where we land on this cloud continuum that AWS makes available. We of course have our in-region capabilities and have the most breadth and depth there and the most capacity there. And if you're happily running your applications in region, this is no discussion trying to convince you to do anything other than that. It's when you find yourself the very real scenarios of either way out at the edge where we're talking about IoT and maybe we're talking about green grass, or in rugged locations where we might be talking about the snow family. If we're also in a disconnected scenario there, we might be talking about that. But I want to zoom in and double click on really the center of this slide, where we have the outposts and local zones and wavelength offerings. And I'll dive into that a little bit deeper in what we're bringing in outposts and how we're bringing AWS technology down to on-premises for you. So this is a big piece to me of what differentiates these servers and outposts. Is we're using the same technology that we use in region. We base these systems on the Nitro system, which is how we run instances in the cloud. And this is a fully managed service offering. So just like in region, like you're used to AWS doing, we are the ones operating and monitoring and pushing patches and updating this hardware so that you don't have to be concerned about any of that. And you can pay attention to kind of your OS or your app and above. And a big piece that has a lot of value for those users who are already doing AWS development, especially the single pane of management of utilizing all the same tools and the same APIs as we use in our AWS regions to keep things consistent for your development. I'm going to talk about the rack solution for just a little bit. This is really to kind of juxtapose what the new announcement is in servers. Outpost racks have been available for a couple of years. They're industry standard 42U racks, but they are a fully assembled full rack. These are very powerful systems. They're set up and installed by AWS. And you really work with AWS to get it delivered on site, connected to power and networking, and then we take care of the rest and manage that entire system. And of course, it's got redundant and well-designed architecture inside of all of these racks. This is a fantastic and powerful solution for anywhere that this is the scale that you're working at. Right, that you have data center space and you can put a rack down, and in those locations, that's fantastic. But if you want to have this conversation about the edge, you know, that becomes pretty obvious pretty fast that, oh, wow, we really need a smaller version of this than a full rack at a time. So that gives us the reason to go introduce you to our new Outpost servers. I'm going to give you kind of a high-level overview of them, and then a little bit more about them. Try to help you understand, you know, hardware in this virtual format as best I can. There's essentially two units visually. There's a 2U and a 1U unit. This covers both Intel and Graviton. We can look at them a little bit deeper here, really, which is where you can see that the Intel version comes in two different capacity sizes, but both are, you know, same dimensions, same weight, standard dual 10 gig networking. There's an interface for initial setup and installation and how we authenticate back to an account and connecting to the right things in as far as the outposts and site, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Goes into initial configuration. So there's an interface for that. And the Nitro security key, I'll actually mention that a little bit more in a minute because both units have that. The other unit is the 1U and is the Graviton 2 based. This unit also has the dual 10 gig networking and the same interface for configuration and the same Nitro security key. The security key is a pretty unique feature on the Outpost servers that allows you to have a method to cryptographically shred data so that, like, let's say you're, you know, you've been utilizing this service fantastically for years and you're end of term and you're going to send a unit back, there is a process by which you can cryptographically shred the data before sending the unit back. And so that's a great ability to have to keep your data secure on any of these servers. So with that, we're going to switch over to talking about the Outpost server experience, and I'd like to introduce Josh.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Appreciate it. My name is Josh Cohen. I'm a solutions architect here at AWS, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Outpost server experience. So now with Outpost, we have this new form factor. Before, as Adam talked a little bit about with Rack, that's the form factor we started with. It was 42U. It's kind of like a big refrigerator. If you don't really talk to people about things in U measurements, so it's kind of like a big refrigerator. And we had a lot of customers come to us and say, "Hey, I like the idea of Outpost. I like the idea of being able to run AWS services on premises, but I don't have enough space to put like an extra refrigerator," as an example. I can't put this 42U rack in. I might not have enough power, or maybe my cooling is not sufficient for this. So this really isn't going to work. So, we took that back, and this is where the Outpost server form factor came in. They're much smaller, like Adam said, 1U, 2U. You can put them in retail stores or branch offices. You can put them in a distribution center, as an example, or maybe in a hospital potentially. So the rack was just too big, is what we were hearing from customers. So this is kind of where servers came from, and these are some of the industries that we've been talking to that really we think that Outpost servers will be a fit. And really, if you want 3, 4, 5 servers in one location, that's great. But if you get any more than that, you might want to consider getting a rack at that point. The servers are really designed for folks that need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 servers in a specific location, but in a lot of locations. So typically, if you just have one location, you need one server. Certainly you could use an Outpost server, but it's really meant to be into these small branch offices or retail stores or manufacturing, but in a lot of different places, because that's really where you start to see the value of servers come from, is the ability to use things that you might already be doing in AWS, similar deployment pipelines, similar operations and management. A lot of our customers we talk to, they have a cloud presence, they have an AWS presence. They maintain a certain set of tooling, deployments, pipelines, and sometimes even personnel to manage their AWS in-region stuff. But then they might have another set of tooling, another set of operations and runbooks, and maybe even personnel to operate the on-premises environment. So marrying those two together can really help streamline things and make you more efficient, and really focus on the things that matter more to your business outside of managing hardware and things that run on that hardware. But these are some of the industries that we really see Outpost servers as a use case. They're not the only ones, but these are some of the big ones. So how does the service work? So if you think about what we do today in a region, and this kind of applies to an Outpost rack or an Outpost server. If you think about what we have in a region today, we have regions, we have availability zones. Those availability zones are essentially one or more data centers with discrete power and HVAC. And inside of those, we have servers. We have a lot of them. And we're really just taking some of that out of our data center and putting it in your data center. But it's still part of the region. It's effectively an extension of an availability zone. So what that means is it needs to be connected back to the region. Outposts, we've designed this purposely as a connected service. So you're going to need a connection back to the region to sort of maintain the control plane that lives in the region with the things that we're running on the Outpost server or even an Outpost rack. So each server has an Outpost ID, and those are considered an outpost, and then we connect them back to the region. And that allows you to do a couple things. One, you can run things locally on the Outpost while still sending things like CloudTrail logs, CloudWatch metrics. That stuff all lives in the region. So we're going to set over that connection. We're going to send those things back to the region. But also on Outpost servers, and we'll talk about the services, we don't have all 200 services or all the services that we have in the region running on an Outpost server for a lot of different reasons. But because we're connected back to the region, you can still leverage those services that are not on the Outpost, but in the region using that connection. And you can still use all of your other tooling that you might be using today in a region. So if you're using CloudFormation, you can still use CloudFormation with Outpost servers or racks as a target. If you use third-party toolings, things like Terraform, you can certainly continue to use those tools with things on Outpost servers. And we'll talk about how does it look like to you whenever you're using an Outpost server. Are there differences from the region? Is it the exact same? Like, what do you need to know? Like, how do you know when something's on an Outpost versus in the region? And we'll talk about that. We've also introduced some new concepts here that don't exist in the region, like a local network interface. This is specific to Outpost servers. On Outpost racks, we're doing something different. But on an Outpost server, in order to get from the server to your local network, which you'll want to do, we have this new interface type called local network interface. And we have a slide on that we can talk through. So from what services do we have on the Outpost? So if you think about region, we have hundreds of services. If you think about Outpost racks, we have a subset of that, maybe 15. Adam can probably correct me if I might be off on my number there, but it's around 15. And then on servers, we have a subset of what we have on rack. So from a compute and storage perspective, we have EC2. We have local instance storage. So there's no EBS on Outpost servers, but we do have instance storage, which provides block storage to your EC2 instances. We use Amazon VPC, or Virtual Private Cloud, for networking. We do have container services. So today, if you were to order an Outpost server, when you got it, you could only use ECS, but we are working on EKS, so our Elastic Kubernetes service. That is coming soon, and you'll be able to run that. So both EKS and ECS, you'll be able to use on Outpost servers. Today, it's only ECS. And then you can run other things. So if you have IoT type workloads, you can use Greengrass. That can run on an Outpost server or rack. You can use SageMaker Neo. And that can also run on top of EC2 essentially. So you can do inference at the edge on an Outpost server or an Outpost rack. And of course, like with everything else, we continue to look to you all and to customers to figure out what things you're looking for on an Outpost server that may not be there today. So as we continue to work on our roadmap and bring new services and features to servers and racks as we get it from the field. So just like with everything else in the region, the same way that we gather feedback and help inform of our roadmap, we do the same thing for Outpost servers as well. So how do you use an Outpost server? So there is no, like, if you open up your AWS console today, there is a services page for Outposts, but that doesn't really let you do a lot of things. In that services page, you see things like the order that you placed, the site information that of where the Outpost server is going to be. There might be some SKUs, and that's about it. You're not going to see any EC2 instances running on the server. You're not going to see any ECS containers. You're not going to see your VPCs there. That's because this really is just like you're in the region. So you're still going to use the EC2 console or the EC2 APIs. You're still going to use the VPC console, the VPC APIs. It's all relatively the same. There might be some additional parameters that you might have to add to, let's say you're using CloudFormation or Terraform to deploy workloads to Outposts. You may have to modify an existing CloudFormation stack or something like that to add in an outpost parameter so you can specify the outpost ID, but it's all the same. That's kind of by design. It's going to look the same. So what's going to happen in order for you to deploy something to an outpost is you do this by extending your VPC or your virtual private cloud from the region down to the outpost. And you don't do this, you don't tell the VPC directly like, hey, I have this outpost, because the VPC effectively isn't aware of an outpost or not. And the way that you do the extension is by way of a subnet. So what you do is, today you can go to the VPC console, use an API, and create a subnet. So the difference here is when you're creating a subnet, you add in the parameter for the outpost ARN. And you can do that using AWS CLI or the APIs, or even through the console. So in the console, you might go to the Outpost Services page, and then there's an option to select whatever outpost you want to use. And then from there, you can say, hey, create a VPC, and that will automatically add the outpost ID. Or you could use the API and add in an additional parameter and just say, hey, go and create this subnet. Oh, and by the way, here's the outpost ARN that I want you to use. So go create the subnet on the outpost. So what that does is now you have a VPC and you have this subnet, or maybe you have multiple subnets that are tagged with your outpost ID. So what that's going to tell our control plane is when you do a run instance for EC2 as an example, and you do that on the subnet tagged with an outpost ID, our control plane knows that, hey, this outpost ID contains this physical server, which is on your premises or in a co-location facility or wherever you've sent that server. So I'm going to go launch this instance, and it's going to launch on that server and not somewhere in the region. So that's how we're doing the extension, and that's how we make the experience be seamless to you, is because it still is VPC, it still is a subnet, and you interact with it the same way that you would as if it were in the region. But it's not. Now it's on your premises on an outpost. Let's talk a little bit about Outpost Servers networking, and I want to spend a few minutes here because it is different. It's different from the way we do things in region. It's different from the way we do things on Outpost racks. And a lot of it is because when you think about what we do with Outpost racks, if you're familiar, we do a lot of layer 3 connectivity to get from the outpost to the local data center network. On Outpost servers, if you remember back to the slide, we were talking about retail locations, we're talking about distribution centers, we're talking about a department store, potentially, maybe a fast food restaurant. They don't always have devices that can do layer 3 and the way that we need to do it. So if we would have implemented servers the same way as we did racks, then customers would have to potentially procure other networking equipment in order to make it work. So we wanted to simplify it based off customer feedback. So what we've done is we've created a new interface type called a local network interface, or an LNI. It's very similar to an ENI, but it's not exactly the same. So basically what we're doing here is, if you think about an EC2 instance, you can assimilate that to like a virtual machine that's dual homed, or a physical server that's dual homed to 2 different networks. So every EC2 instance on your Outpost server is going to have 2 interfaces. One will be an ENI, and that lets you participate inside of VPC. And the second interface will be LNI, and that lets you participate within your local network. So it's that LNI appears on your local network like any other layer 2 device would appear on your network. So there's no layer 3, there's no BGP that's needed to get to and from the Outpost server. It's just layer 2, and you can use this LNI. I won't dive super deep into here, but you'll use this interface to get to your network, and you need to treat it like any other layer 2 device on your network. So you'll need to give it an IP, you'll need to give it DNS, a default gateway. Because it doesn't take part in VPC and it's basically directly attached to your local network, you can't use things like the VPC route table or VPC DHCP or security groups or anything else. Just think about this interface and any traffic going over this interface as another layer 2 device. So the same way that you give out an IP or do firewalling for layer 2 devices on your network, that's how you would treat this interface on your EC2 instances. From a physical perspective, there are 2 10 gig, there one connection dedicated for the service link. So again, this is the traffic going back to the region. And then we have one connection dedicated to local network. And that's basically what the LNI will go over. And then you would typically separate these things with a VLAN. You'd have one VLAN for the traffic going to the region for your to maintain that connectivity, and then another VLAN for things going over your local network. You can have multiple VLANs coming into the Outpost server if you want to. It's really up to you of how you do it. But you can just have one single VLAN and leave it at that. Outpost servers and the ability to use the same APIs and use the same tooling also allows you to do some interesting things from an architecture perspective. So, you might only want to buy one server for every location you want, but you want to have some sort of backup in case the server goes down. You don't want your business to be impacted if you have a server failure. So because things are relatively the same between an Outpost server and the AWS region, you can use the region potentially as a secondary or tertiary location. Maybe you have two Outpost servers at every location, and you're using those for high availability, as an example. But you want to, in case the store goes down or the network goes down or something goes down inside the store that prevents you from using both of those servers, you could have a tertiary location in the AWS region. And using the same APIs, and because it's still EC2, you can very easily architect for that. Now, it's not going to be just a flip of a switch, right? There's some considerations you'll have to take into account as you're designing for this. But because effectively everything is the same, it makes it a much easier transition to do disaster recovery to the region, or the opposite. Maybe you want to use the region as your primary, but you have other discrete locations somewhere that, in case you lose connectivity to the region, that you want to be able to use something local on your premises or wherever it is that you're doing maybe transactions or wherever your workload lives, and having an Outpost server there could be your secondary. We typically see it the other way around, but you can certainly have the region as the primary with an Outpost server as a backup. We also have something called local zones, which we won't talk about here, but local zones is also another option. So customers that have like low latency concerns, right? They're not super close to a region, so they're looking at Outpost racks or Outpost servers to help solve for that. But they also want a backup in case the server or the rack goes down. A local zone could be closer to your site or sites than a region, and you could use a local zone as a backup. And a local zone, I like to think of, you have a region, bunch of services, you have an Outpost, small set of services on your premises, and then you have a local zone which kind of sits in the middle there. So a local zone is also another option to be sort of a backup to an Outpost server. All right, so I'm going to pass it back to Adam and let him talk to you about a little bit more about designing for the edge with Outposts.
Thank you very much, Josh. Yeah, I'm going to walk you now through some of the partners and example architectures we're supporting with AWS Outposts. First off, as of launch, we're working with a variety of partners to complement the Outpost server solution. These include things like storage, of course, for durability and backups, and for local present data, and networking and security with CrowdStrike for monitoring and alerting. We also are working with some ISV type partners in the hospitality and retail solution space and in the telco space. You'll hear more about partners in the future, I believe. And I wanted to zoom out a little bit just to make sure, like if I zoom out of Outposts for a minute, well, both rack and servers, they're kind of right dead center of your screen. Rack and server form factors are part of a range of AWS options for different needs, really. We've got everything from far edge microcontrollers and IoT devices to rugged disconnected locations with the Snowball family that I mentioned earlier. to the on-premises that we've been mostly focused on here today, where Outposts is a great solution, and all the way to 5G telco services with wavelength. And for all these low latency applications, we're continually adding more regions, more availability zones, more points of presence, edge locations, and those local zones that Josh was talking about. Our vision really here is around being able to meet you where you are operating with the right set of services and available for you and your use case. Now, talking about servers in particular, I wanted to, hopefully I've gotten you excited enough about the prospect of servers that you want to check this out for yourself now. And, I want to talk you through what it looks like ordering these things and getting a hold of them. First of all, we're supported in Outpost servers, are available in 49 different countries and territories around the world today. They can be mapped to any of the 21 commercial AWS regions where the Outpost service is available. And we're going to continue adding more here. This is a great area where getting us feedback about potential regions that you'd like to see supported. We'd love to hear more about that so we can plan for it. I'm going to go into these 3 steps in a little bit more depth in just a second, but this is the high level of really what you do to get started with Outpost servers. You order them. That's right through the console. You have a pretty simple DIY setup and install, and then you launch the system, and you get to the point that it's just an available capacity for you to define to run instances on. There is some prerequisites we want to talk through. These things have to be installed in a adequate location before ordering. We like to see these prerequisites be walked through. As a customer, the first thing you need to know is you'll need to be able to provide space, power, networking for the Outpost servers themselves. So that's the 1 or 2 U of rack space available. That's the 10 gig networking capability. And we also do want to point out that this equipment is known to be loud. It runs around 66 to 78 decibels. So you don't want this in the middle of a space that people are having conversations. You also need to establish network connection from your site to an AWS region. That means, network switches, 10 gig uplink ports, an internet connection through an internet service provider, or through maybe you go the AWS Direct Connect route. You'll need to either make sure that someone from your team, I don't know if that's a site manager or a local resource on-prem there, is able to receive these servers, of course, and install them. A third party could also be arranged to do that, to come to your site. And finally, with servers, you should also know you do need to have enterprise support. This is where we can give you the 24/7 technical support needed, and it's also where the Outposts experts are available for support. So a bit more about those 3 steps I mentioned earlier. I wanted to show you how simple and straightforward this is. You literally will be able to go through the AWS Management Console, and you can order. I'd also point out that is supported on CLI and SDK. It's you're able to browse the Outpost catalog. You can just check out what SKUs you want to order. It's not very complex. There's the 3 different versions, the 2U versions and the 1U version. You'll be able to select which version and create a site and capture the information, things like shipping address, etc. And you'll create an actual outpost. That's the resource that'll be used to manage your local capacity, and you'll be able to use tags if you want to group that otherwise. And then you'll be able to use the console dashboard to track fulfillment status of those servers. And then some happy day, this brand new shiny box shows up for install, and when that arrives, your on-prem resource, whoever that is just going to need to unbox and do pretty basic rack and stack type of setup that most people are pretty familiar with, and a pretty straightforward configuration for networking and for account that this is accessed through. And ultimately, when you get that all configured, we get to the point that, definitely in quotes, phone home, we're going to use your connection back to the AWS region. And once that connection's up, then you can start seeing remotely the install status. The remote will remotely finish the configuration to the point that capacity will just be marked active for you to be ready to start launching instances. And then I think that's when the real fun begins of, as Josh was talking about earlier, creating a subnet and extending and starting to be able to manage your resources and launch instances into that outpost. And you're off to the races essentially at that point. So with that, I'd like to hand it back to Josh. He's got a demo available for us.
Okay, thanks, Adam. In this demo, we have a short 3-4 minute demo, but we partnered with one of our launch partners, Vistry, which you may have seen on the slide that Adam showed around our partners. And Vistry does restaurant automation and AI for restaurants. So we worked with them to create a pretty neat demo, just showcasing maybe some of the possibilities with Outpost servers. So let's go ahead and play that demo.
Hi, I'm Tatiana Cook, Principal Product Manager on the AWS Outposts team, and I'll be joined today by Atif Qureshi, founder of Vistry AI, and Josh Cohen, Senior Solution Architect, to talk about how Outpost technology can help our customers optimize operations and brew the perfect cup of coffee. Now, I'll hand it over to Atif, who will talk about how, combined with Outpost servers, the Discern platform can help customers improve operations in retail and hospitality.
So today what we're going to show you is a glimpse into the kitchen of the future. And we have our barista here, Josh Cohen, who is operating a smart coffee machine. Now this smart coffee machine is outfitted with several sensors that includes temperature sensors as well as weight sensors to understand the current state of the coffee setup. Additionally, we also have ambient sensors, which is measuring the temperature and the humidity of the environment. And lastly, we have an image sensor, a camera, that is focused on the tabletop. Now, the vision system using the camera is looking to detect and track how long coffee cups are on the coffee table and ensure that we understand how they degrade over time. So this example, while rather simplified, is indicative of what we see many restaurant operators pursuing, which is understanding how the physical environment is being observed and digitizing that information to understand deeper insights. As we saw from our barista, Josh, as he poured out coffees and went to serve our guests, we now can have a look at the digital data that's created from those physical observations. What we see here on the left-hand side is our vision system. And our vision system is detecting and tracking the cups as they are on the tabletop. And what you see is durations for each individual unique ID. On the right-hand side, we're looking at the sensor data, and that sensor data includes the ambient temperature and humidity, as well as sensors that are specifically on the smart coffee machine. Now, all of this is interesting if we're just looking at one restaurant, but where the insights really derive from is when you're looking at thousands of restaurants and you can start to uncover guest experiences or operational inefficiencies that are surfacing due to what's happening within the restaurant physical environment. So now we've seen a glimpse into the kitchen of the future enabled by Outposts. We are really excited to be able to run our AI workloads seamlessly in the cloud and at the edge to enable restaurant operators to create a better future.
So just to break down the demo a little bit for what you just saw. So this is a very high level architecture of what's actually happening. So on the left, we have our region. In this case, it's US West 2. And then what we're doing is we're extending the US West 2B availability zone from the region down to an Outpost server. And on the Outpost server, we have the Vistry components deployed there. So that includes sort of the Vistry stack that they run. It also includes InfluxDB as a way to store some of those metrics that we're getting from the Smart Coffee Pot, and then a Grafana dashboard. So what's actually happening is a few different things. So there's cameras set up that we're running an RTSP feed, and that feed is going from the cameras into the Vistry stack. And then once it gets into the Vistry stack, we're doing a couple things there. We're recording it in the InfluxDB, and then we're also pushing it to Grafana. And then the Smart Coffee Pot, we have a bunch of different sensors for things like the coffee pot temperature, the weight, the ambient room temperature, the humidity in the room. And we're taking all those, I think it's like a 1 second interval, and we're taking those metrics and we're pushing that into InfluxDB, and then pushing that into Grafana, or Grafana is pulling that. I think that's how it works. It's pulling, not pushing, from Influx. And that's what's displaying all the stats. So in the Grafana dashboard, you're seeing, as you saw, right, the camera feed, you're seeing all the different types of information that the Vistry stack is pulling from that camera feed and overlaying on top of it, as well as all the metrics in a time series fashion for the coffee pot. So from what we talked about earlier, right, like this Outpost server connects back to this region. That's an always connected over what we call the service link. And then everything that's happening from the camera, from the coffee pot down to the Outpost server, that's going over that local network interface, or that LNI. So the Vistry stack is EC2 instances, and inside I think they're running Docker. And then Influx is an EC2 instance, Grafana is an EC2 instance, and all those have LNIs attached to them. And it's communicating back to the camera and to the Smart Coffee Pot over the respective LNIs. So for more resources, we have a link here. We have a QR code. Feel free to check that out. This will tell you even more information about Outpost servers than we've covered here. And then there are links to, you can see our partners there, as well as a bunch of other materials, user guide that gives you some of the environmentals that we briefly touched on today.